All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Geopolitics in Conflict Show. Very excited to be with you today because of my guest. You guys been asking for Mr. McGovern. He is here. So we're going to have a very interesting conversations. And please send your comments, whatever you want. Just remember to share the link with others because this is a conversation you're not going to hear anywhere else. So I'm very excited. Good to have you, Ray. Very excited to have you here on our show.
Thanks, David. Glad to be with you.
Yeah. So what I'm gonna do, guys, for you, I'm gonna do a very brief intro about Ray, and I'm gonna put the link for you in the description along with everything else. So for now, suffice it to say, for those who do not know who Raymond McGovern, he goes by the name Ray, first name there. He was a CIA analyst for 27 years. Yeah, you heard me. 27 years from 1963 to 1990. And in the 80s, he happened to be chairing the National Intelligence Estimates and also prepared what is known for us in the intelligence community at the time as the PDB, which is the Presidential Daily Briefing. So once again, guys, I am gonna put the full bio for Ray for you in the description. So we don't want to waste too much time. We're gonna get into our conversation here. So what I would like to have your input, Ray, is I like to get your feedback as an analyst to analyst here. You've seen a lot. You've been around long enough to witness how the U.S. foreign policy, if there was ever one. I would like to get your perspective about the U.S. involvement now in the Middle East with the Israeli conflict, and whether can we be talking about the fall of the Western order as you and I know it.
Well, the latter is true. We could talk about that forever, but let's focus right in on what's going on now. What's going on now is different from all other imbroglios in the Middle East. Our country, that is my country, which I love dearly, is supporting genocide. Do not blanch before the word. It's carefully defined in international law, genocide, and the Israeli leaders are bragging about it. They are admitting it. They're proud of it. They say we'll cut off water, food, fuel until these Palestinians are taught a lesson or driven out. Okay? They're being very explicit about it. It's not like they're trying to hide it. Now, the thing that really hurts me, David, is that my country is enabling this. Without the United States of America, Israel could not do genocide in Gaza. I don't think anybody with a reasonable mind would dispute that. So why is the United States, why is this United States so identified with Israel that it would do these things? It's an anomaly. It's unique. Professor John Mearsheimer, the head of the Realist School of International Relations, has said that never before in recorded history have two countries been joined at the hip, his word, to such an extent that for the United States, it will support Israel no matter what. That's also Mearsheimer's word. Whoa. So do U.S. interests always coincide with Israeli interests? Of course they don't. Right now, the U.S. is losing all manner of respect and prestige and influence throughout the whole world by condoning and enabling, I use that word again, enabling this genocide. So how does this all come about? Well, it has its antecedents with Zionism. And, I have to tell you, David, when I was a boy, right, I grew up in the Bronx, New York City, right? I was 9 years old in 1948. And there was great rejoicing. There were parades. There were bands. Israel had its own country. This poor, persecuted people had their own country. And I rejoiced along with everyone else. What did I know at 9 years old? Nobody told me. Nobody told me there were already people there, that the Palestinians were being driven out of their homeland for several centuries, and actually you could say millennia, uh, driven out. How many of them? 700,000. Others say 750,000 Palestinians. Where were they driven? To Gaza, and to Syria, and to Jordan, and to Lebanon, and even to Saudi Arabia. There are as many Palestinians living, as you probably know, David, in those areas as there are living in Palestine proper. So here we have this anomaly where John Mearsheimer says this is really unique. Now, the American people don't know this. Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons. Joe Biden says he's the best Zionist in the world. Now, that doesn't mean Jew, that means Zionist.
Zionist.
That means the people came in and drove out the Palestinians in 1948. The press, the media in our country, it's a known fact, heavily influenced by Zionism. Now, Congress, there's something called the Israel lobby, which actually John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt wrote a book about. And that lobby is all powerful because they have unlimited funds to choose people to be in the Senate or in the House, and they're even active in primaries now. And I can tell you one recent example if you wish later. But let me just finish here. So Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister for forever, in 2001, David, he's in a constituent's house, nice little living room, and he's talking. He's really relaxed, and there's a video camera going, and Netanyahu said, "Turn that off. Turn that off." The fellow forgets to turn it off. Okay. So this is recorded. It's on YouTube. I transcribed what Netanyahu said. He said, we have to make it so painful in Palestine that we'll drive all up in as Palestinians. So we have to make chaos so they could see that they can't live here. Okay. And a woman, the hostess, says, well, Mr. Netanyahu, won't the world react? Won't they call us occupiers? And Netanyahu, get this now, Netanyahu says, yes, so what?
What?
So what? It's really ridiculous. Get this. 80% of the American people support us. It's absurd. Wow. Period. End quote. Now, that was then. The difference, David, is now it's less than 50% of the American people support Israel now because many of us have a conscience and they can see, thanks to iPhones and other photography and other images, what the Israelis are doing in terms of genocide in Gaza. Now we have a humanitarian pause in the genocide. Does that sound a little strange to you? A little kind of oxymoronic, humanitarian genocide? Give me a break. So we have to stop this. And the key, of course, is that neither Biden nor Netanyahu can do any of this without support of the American people. And the American people are starting to speak out now. Jews, the Jewish Voice for Peace, of which I'm a member, proud member, has shut down Grand Central Station, one of the bridges in Manhattan. People are going to get up and say, look, not in our name shall we do this. And it just has to stop.
I'm aware of the Jewish community in New York. I went to school in Pennsylvania, so I used to go to New York a lot to spend a lot of time there. So I'm very familiar with how, and you're absolutely correct, Ray, is the idea that at least for us Americans, I mean, it pains me as one who worked in DC, well, former military and so forth, to see where the country is headed as far as its foreign policies. And now we're taking part of this genocide that's been going on. And some of us, when we speak the truth, we end up being labeled, you are anti-system. No, truth matters because that's how we ought to be. Here is where I found the trouble, Ray, is the idea that international institutions like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, why isn't it stepping forward by requesting an investigation of Netanyahu for conducting war crimes?
Well, as you know, there are attempts now to prosecute the Israeli leaders,
Hmm.
but the fly in the ointment is, as you suspect, predominant U.S. influence in
Sure.
these institutions. That goes not only for the ICC, but for the EU, but for also the UN. Now, I'll say a word about the UN. Um, there is hope there.
Yeah.
As you know, on the last resolution, even the United States didn't veto it. It was a humanitarian pause in the genocide, and that really grates that expression.
Yeah.
But at least it went through, right? Now, what's going to happen now? What's today? Tuesday? Tomorrow, the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi,
Yeah.
is going to be in New York at the UN. China happens to chair the UN Security Council this month, so they got 2 days left.
Wow.
He is chairing this meeting.
Mm.
Now, I don't know what he's going to do, but if I were advising him, I'd say, look, it's real easy. There's something on the books already. It's Security Council Resolution 242, November 22nd, 1967. Israel must withdraw from
Yeah.
all the occupied territories it seized in 1967. Okay, that's real easy.
Yeah.
Unanimous was that there was that resolution. So why is the UN pussyfooting around here? We have to enforce that resolution. Now, will the U.S. veto a motion to enforce that resolution? Probably, but there are other ways to get at this problem. There's a General Assembly. The
Yeah.
UN is something that looks like it's sort of a residual organ, but it's not. You know why? Because the Chinese and because the Russians still believe that there has to be some sort of world order, that was a real mistake not to have such before World War II, and that
Yeah.
this so-called international rules-based order is not only a fiction, but it's a disguise for U.S. hegemony, and that is slithering away. The sooner it goes, the better,
Yeah.
assuming it can go without undue violence.
Mm. Well, you mentioned the UN, Ray. That brought to memory for me the latest resolution where the US, of course, rejected the call for the ceasefire. There were about 14 countries. The US was at the top. Sadly, for our country not to push for something that is right. There were about 46 countries or 44, don't quote me on this because that was the number, that abstained from that. The rest of the world was calling for a ceasefire. And the reason I'm bringing this up is to get your input as to, is this goes far beyond just the call for a ceasefire and reflect on the current geopolitical landscape in the Middle East that is changing and certainly pivoting east, which means the end of the US dominance in the Middle East is coming to a close. Will I be wrong if I suggest something like that?
No, I think you're right. Um, the resolution you're referring to, 14-1, one being the
Yes.
U.S. vetoing it, was for a ceasefire. Okay. Now, a ceasefire has a juridical meaning. Okay.
Mhm.
Uh, U.S. didn't want that kind of juridical setup behind the ceasefire. Now, the next vote, as I recall, was for a pause in the bombing. Finally, the U.S. enabled that by abstaining with one other, I believe. Okay, so that's where it rests at the UN. The rest of your question has disappeared in my mind. Please repeat it.
Yeah, it just has to do with, is this reflection of the
Ah,
changes of the geopolitical landscape? Because in the Middle East, we are already witnessing the shift from the US towards the east. I give the example of Saudi Arabia. I give the example of GCC countries. They are all pivoting east economically and strategically. Could this spell the notion that the US era of dominance in the Middle East is coming to a close? Will I be wrong in this assessment?
no, right again, as I would say as a teacher. Uh, the uh, the dissolution of U.S. dominance in the
Mm,
Middle East has been long in coming, but it was given a big push by Trump. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, he did some really outlandish things like recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, like saying the Golan Heights, well, they're part of Israel now, like all manner of other things, and letting settlers just continue to settle. Okay,
Mm.
so that started then. The interesting thing is that Trump thought that he could send his son Jared to charm all these Arab leaders into thinking that the Palestinians, all 14, let's see, 14, yeah, all 14 million of them don't count.
Count.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whoa. Now, so they did all these nice little accords. Some of the Arab states more subservient to the U.S. signed on diplomatic relations with Israel and all that kind of stuff, completely forgetting about their Palestinian brothers and sisters. Now, Hamas had other ideas. Now, whatever you think of the cruelty, and no one likes cruelty, of their attack on October 7th, as the head of the UN said, Gutierrez, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It
Yeah.
happened in the backdrop of the 75 years that I just referred to, 1948. I was 9 years old. The Palestinians were driven out, and half of the people in Gaza are direct descendants of the ones that were expelled from
Mm.
Israel at that time. So, how did they think they could get away with this? Well, it took Hamas to mount this action to sensitize people to, whoa, this is this is unjust, okay? And to make these Arab leaders realize that, look, you've got your own Palestinians
Palestine.
populations there. They're not going to tolerate this, and you shouldn't tolerate this either. So, as a result of that, as you well refer to, there's this coalescence. You have
Mm-hmm.
you have Iran and Saudi Arabia. You have Turkey and Bashar al-Assad from Syria.
Syria.
These guys used to hate each other, right? They're at the same meeting now. This was a week ago. What did they decide? Well, I don't know exactly what they decide. A lot of people were disappointed because they, took nice rhetoric, but
Yeah.
didn't warn anything about intervention in this imbroglio. But I kind of think that it's a new world now. It's not just me thinking this, others do too. And so the US has to come to the realization that this is not only bad for the US, it's bad for Bibi Netanyahu. And the problem is that Biden is not fully compos mentis,
Yeah.
and his advisors are fully extraordinary people who think that the US is exceptional and can work its will wherever throughout the world. They really think that. And so, what are they going to advise Biden to do? Just hunker down there, stay with the Israelis, stay safe with the Congress, stay safe with the media, and all bedlam is going to happen. Already, more than 1 million people from Gaza
Yeah.
have been driven south. Okay, now they're going to bomb the south. This is going to force, in my view, not only the surrounding Arab countries, but Turkey and Iran to think about how they prevent a genocide. And again, I use the term advisedly. Let me just finish with this, David. Everybody says, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, right? They defend itself. Well, guess what? Israel does not, under international law,
Well,
have the right to defend itself in Gaza. Why? Because under international law, observed by everyone, Gaza is occupied territory.
sorry.
Okay? So here you go. Back in World War II, you're too young. I was alive during the whole war. What
Mm.
happened? Well, some of the French summoned the guts to oppose the Vichy government and the
Mhm.
Nazis in France. Now, are you suggesting, or anybody would suggest, that the Nazis had the right to defend themselves against the occupied peoples? I don't think so.
Yeah.
They didn't. Okay. Now, since the war, the legal code on all this has been refined to the point where you don't have to kill 6 million people. Okay, you can kill a portion of that ethnic group, like maybe 2 million in Gaza, maybe 1 million. This is crazy. Killing people, ethnic cleansing, genocide. I mean, we really have to get American people sensitized and have their consciences awaken to the notion that we are enabling this. It makes me so sad to realize that and to have to say it in hopes that your program and others will get this word out. That's not us. That's not America.
You're absolutely correct, Ray. It pains me. It really pains me to say this about my country, that it's behaving in a way that I'm ashamed. It's sad. Let alone as an American, as a taxpayer, I'm asking the questions as to why is the government wasting our tax money on Israel or Ukraine for issues that have nothing to do with our welfare or our well-being here in the United States. We got enough issues here at home, let alone the
Well,
government
David,
spending that tax money
yeah.
for no justification whatsoever.
Well, there you put your finger on a major aspect of this. Where's our tax money going? It's
Yeah.
going to defense. Now, you
Uh,
said that we're not profiting from this. Well, the top 1% is profiting up the kazoo, if I can use a
indeed.
Bronx expression. Okay, they're
Indeed.
getting richer and richer. I have a new term for what Eisenhower talked about in terms of the military industrial
That's right.
complex. Now, you'll remember, just as he's going out of office, he said, what you really should be afraid of, the major threat to democracy in this country is the military industrial complex. Now, he meant to say, well, he wanted in his draft, we know stricken out is the military industrial congressional
No, that's
complex.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that his granddaughter finally asked him, why'd you strike that out? And he said, well, I needed to get a couple things through Congress before I left.
Well,
you know, so right now, he warned that the only antidote to
yeah.
the accretion of power, whether he said whether willed or just not willed, of the military industrial complex is a well informed citizenry. We ain't got that now. Instead of the MIC, instead of the military industrial complex, we have what I call the Mickey Mat. Okay. You can remember it. It sort of rhymes with Mickey Mouse, but it's much more serious. Okay.
Okay.
Here it is. Got a pencil?
Yeah.
Military. It's the military industrial congressional intelligence, media,
Wow.
academia, think tank complex. Mickey Mat. Now, why do I say media as if in all capital letters?
Yeah.
Because the media is the linchpin. You can't do this without the media. You
Indeed.
can't have a well-informed citizenry if the media is in control by the same people and the rest of the Mickey Mat. So it's really, really bad now. And a lot of the explanation as to how we give $3.8 billion a year to Israel for defense and why we're in Ukraine, why we keep spending all this money on non-workable anti-ballistic missile systems.
Yeah.
Well, it's because some rich people are getting much richer. And as you pointed out correctly, the rest of the U.S. populace is suffering, and there are more people in poverty now than I can remember.
Yeah. And we will talk about Ukraine soon enough. And so just to conclude this part here, and I'm going to move to a next topic that I like to have your input on. And the next topic that I'd like to cover with you, Ray, is where do you see, I mean, given as one who spent for you 27 years as an analyst inside in Washington, you had the real seat at the front seat of truly understanding, especially when it comes down to back then the Soviet Union and so forth. So my question to you, Ray, is where do you see the Russian-China relations moving forward, given the shifting sands of the global geopolitical landscape? I argued, by the way, I wrote a book about Russia a few years ago, just a few years ago, and I mentioned in it, and please correct me if I'm wrong in this assessment. And I wrote, I recall this, that it is just a matter of time before a strategic alliance between China and Russia is formed. And watch out, that's going to change the global geopolitical landscape in more ways that the West cannot influence. Will I be wrong in this, Ray?
No, again, you have it right. And I have to confess that I started studying this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
We used to call it the Sino-Soviet conflict
Conflict.
because that's what it was. 1963. Do the
Wow.
math.
The
Okay.
height of it.
That was
Yes.
that was my first account at the CIA. And in those days, the Russians and the Chinese were at each other's throats. They were shooting each other across the river borders that they have. They were claiming territory. The Chinese were claiming parts of Siberia seized under unequal treaties in the 17th century.
Yeah.
And was that true? Yes. Okay.
Wow.
There were all kinds of things. And the challenge there was to prove to our ideological leaders that even though they were both communists, they were at loggerheads. Now, we were dismissed. They're both communists. Don't be deceived by all the rhetoric. Well, I'll tell you a little story. I was telling this story without much evidence except the rhetoric and also the involvement in international communist parties around the world. There was a clear jostling for power between Soviet and Chinese factions. In any case, against all the naysayers, a fellow called me up from the imagery people who run the satellites. Okay, in those days, this was 1960s. Okay, we had satellites, but it was not real time. You had to drop a bucket of film into the ocean, okay? And then the U.S. Navy tried to catch it before it hit the ocean. They were waterproof. They got this bucket. They sent it right to Rochester, to Kodak people, and a lot of my buddies went right up there to read all these things. And I got a call. Ray, you're going to be really happy about this. Why? Well, we just found 15 highly trained, highly equipped Soviet divisions on the Chinese border. Wow. Now, what further proof was necessary? Those 15 divisions grew to 40 divisions on the Chinese border. And that's when Kissinger and Nixon asked us, wow, you think maybe we can play on this? The Chinese, are they worried about this? We sure as hell are. Yeah. Well, maybe we can do it. And so you know the rest of that story. The U.S. was very adroit in exploiting these tensions, not only to cultivate better relations with China, but having done that, create fear in Russia that the Chinese are stealing a march in cultivating relations with us. And so what happened? So 1971, Kissinger goes to China. 1972, January, I think, Nixon goes to China. What happens next? A Berlin Agreement. Four-power agreement on Berlin permitting access. Decades of tight negotiations on that breakthrough. What do we tell Kissinger and Nixon? Look, this is really extraordinary. It looks like they're afraid that the Chinese are going to develop better relations with you. You probably can exploit this. And so they said, well, are they interested in arms control? We said, yeah, they don't want to be driven into an everlasting spending spiral, but also they're afraid that the Chinese will develop relations. So with you. So, yeah. And that's what happened. I had the privilege of being in Moscow for the signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty. And that was part and parcel of something that we successfully persuaded the Russians to do, because the Russians didn't have to want to deal with a Chinese enemy at that time and an American enemy. Now, I just put a little codicil to that. We were so much a part of that treaty that Kissinger says, well, will the Soviets violate this treaty? And I said, don't know. Well, if they do, how quickly can you tell us? So I went back to the people that run the satellites and so forth. And I said, well, how soon will we know if they build another big radar? And they said, about 10 days. I go back, I say, about 10 days, Mr. Kissinger. Okay, we can trust if we can know in 10 days. Now, they went to trust, verify. Our job was to verify, did the Russians cheat? Yes, they cheated. Did they build a great big new radar? Yes, they did. Where? In the middle of Siberia, a place called Krasnoyarsk. Did we catch them in 10 days? We did. Reagan was in charge at that point. And he said, okay, go show them the photos. Go tell them to tear that thing down. The radar, not the Berlin Wall just yet. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, they fought it, of course. When Gorbachev came in, he said, all right, Mr. Bush, who was president then, George H.W. Bush, all right, it's a damn ABM radar. We're going to tear it down. Now, what's my point there? We used to talk to these guys. We used to show them what we had in terms of intelligence. You're cheating. This is against the rules. Tear it down. And they did. Now, there's not even any talking, much less confrontation on these basic issues. So you're right. Right now, I would say, in a curious kind of way, that the relationship between China and Russia is as tight as that one I described between the U.S. and Israel, except this one is realistic. This faces a common enemy in terms of the imperial United States. They are very close. And I've been saying for a couple of years now, maybe it's because I read your book, that if there's a dust up in Ukraine, there will be a dust up in the South China Sea as well. And our military planners will have to wake up and say, oh, do we really want to have a two-front war?
Which we can afford. Which we can afford, Ray.
And we're not even equipped. Our military is not up to it. And now we have the Middle East. So, they say three's a charm, right? did these Blinkens and Sullivan, they think, well, yeah, we can handle it. Janet Yellen, the treasurer, can we fund that? Of course we got enough money. No. These guys are delusional. And I just hope that reality will sink in once it's clear that the Russians have won militarily in Ukraine, which they have already done. And once it's clear that Israel's not going to be able to work its will in Gaza as they always have been able to do in the past.
That's an interesting point, right? Just for our viewers, for those who are just joining us here, I'm having a conversation here with Ray McGovern. He's a former CIA analyst for almost 27 years. So the idea of what you just talked about, Ray, I'm leaning towards saying now that the new global order, this multipolar system that is upon us now. I know there are those in Washington. I still talk to some folks in DC that is still the thinking persists as no. The Earth still the sole power of a superpower. I said no, that era is gone. Wake up to the reality. We are entering into a multipolar system by which it's not going to be pushed by ideology. Rather, it's going to be pushed by economic blocks. Am I fair in this assessment, Ray?
I think you're absolutely right. The key words are exceptional or even indispensable.
Indeed.
Now, you'll recall that Madeleine Albright, under President Clinton, coined the word indispensable. We are the indispensable nation in the world. We can do whatever we want. We have a very powerful armed forces. She turns to Colin Powell and she says, why don't we use them more? You brag about these great armed forces. Why don't we use them? So that was the attitude, okay? And that attitude was so insidious that when we launched sanctions on Iraq, 500,000 children under the age of 5 died. Okay. Now, when she was asked about that, Leslie Stahl, who used to be one of these interviewers, she's pretty
Mhm.
prominent, her conscience was clearly bothering her. She says, now, Madam Secretary Albright, uh, 500,000 children, uh, you think it's worth it? And Albright said, yes, it's worth it. We think it's worth it. Okay. Now, that's the attitude. Why do I go back to that? Because I was always wondering, now, does Biden really believe this kind of thing, that it's worth it? That
Yeah.
it's worth 500,000 young Ukrainian men being killed just to pursue this proxy war against Russia? Does he think that? Well, I got an answer to that. Okay. A month and a half ago, he was up in Maine campaigning, and he's in a private house, and he's in the living room, and he's talking to people, and he talks about Madeleine Albright, how wonderful she was, and how she
Uh,
had it exactly right, that we are the only indispensable country. We were exceptional, and guess what? He said that in his speech right
mm,
after the lid blew off Gaza. Okay, so what am I saying here? These guys actually believe this, and it's going to be a rude awakening when the American people learn that what Biden said 2 months ago, oh, Russia has already lost in Ukraine, and what the head of the CIA said the next week, not only have the Russians lost, the ineptitude of their military power has been exposed for the whole world to see. My God! Now, where do they're not getting their information from us veteran intelligence professionals for
yeah.
sanity. There's no sanity there at all. So, what am I saying here? I'm saying these people have a real comeuppance coming. And how are they going to explain when it's very clear that Kiev has lost, that there's no prospect of getting enough more arms and more Mickey Matt profits to Kiev? They've lost. Now, if Ukraine is seen to be lost, which is inevitable in my view in the next couple of months, not
Mhm.
only that they lost, but they are acknowledged to have lost, what's going to happen? These guys have their eyes on the next election, right? If
Mhm.
Ukraine is lost, the election is lost. Not only that, if the
Mm,
election is lost, our freedom might be lost.
lost. Mm,
They have the goods in court testimony, other court documents on bribery allegations on Joe Biden as well as his son. They know that Tony Blinken uh, tried to fix the election for Biden when he whooped up that story about the 51 former
mm,
intelligence leaders that said that Hunter's laptop had all earmarks of a Russian
yeah.
intelligence disinformation
Information. Yeah.
campaign, a bald-faced lie. But 3 days before the last debate between Trump and Biden, and Trump naturally says, well, what about that laptop? Shows not only lascivious activity, but signs of bribery. What about that? And Joe Biden says, oh, Mr. Trump, don't you understand that 50 intelligence leaders, including 3 former leaders of the CIA, have said that bears all the earmarks of a Russian intelligence disinformation operation? Come on. Yeah, the election happens within the next week. Biden wins. Now, am I saying that he might not have won? I don't know. It's hard to
Yeah.
prove that kind of thing, but it certainly helped. What's my point? Blinken is guilty as sin on that because their court testimony from an acting head of the CIA saying
Yeah. Yeah.
Blinken made me do it. Okay. And
Yeah.
Sullivan, of course, Sullivan is responsible for this whole Russiagate stuff, including the spurious charge
Mm,
that the Russians hacked into the DNC emails, so prejudiced to Hillary Clinton. Nobody hacked into those emails, and we know that also from court testimony, which in the next 5 days, David,
yeah.
will be 6 years old,
Old.
and Americans have never heard that the head of the cyber firm that looked into those DNC emails found out that the Russians didn't hack them. There was no technical evidence that anyone hacked them. Now, That was testimony taken on the 5th of December, 1917. Do the math. On the 15th of December next week, it will be 6 years. You check with your American friends and see if they know that the Russian hacking thing was manufactured by the likes of Jacob Sullivan and Tony
Yeah.
Boykin. And they'll say, wow, come on, what are you in, Trump's puppet?
Yeah.
So we have to work on that. And that's why I'm so delighted to be able to chat with your audience, David, because I suspect they are interested in this kind of truth.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Ray, just off a sideline here. I did check on that, and it was no Russian involvement. I did contact some people that I know. So let me ask you a last question on this part here, and we're gonna move into Ukraine, because this
Sure.
question a lot of our viewers here in channels been asking, wanted to, so especially from a well-established analyst such as yourself. The opinion will matter here. So, and of course, matters of opinion, but I trust your judgments and respect your opinion as one who read a lot about you during my days in Washington. So this is, to me, that's how I learn. As an analyst myself, I had to look in the past. I learned from history, and I looked through the individuals who went through the system with some credibility and so forth. And so the question, Ray, is this: can a hot war launch between the US and China? And if so, will we see Russia, North Korea, and Iran aligning with China? In other words, you're going to see we already hearing the talk about the formation of this alliance between those four countries: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Now, if there is a hot war regarding the Taiwan issue, I don't foresee this, but let's just hypothetically ask the question, what if? Would you see that the Russians, North Koreans, and the Iranians will come to the support of China?
I do see that.
Wow.
This burgeoning alliance between not only China and Russia,
Hmm.
but North Korea and Iran, these people have a common enemy, let's face it, you know.
Yes.
Um, Now, the US has a really weird policy with respect to China.
Mhm.
Again, it's a sort of an ideological, we're exceptional and indispensable policy. The first time that the new President Biden addressed this issue was 6 weeks after he had been elected. And he got up and he said, you know, the Chinese, they aspire to be the most powerful political, economic. They aspire to be the most powerful country in the world, but that's not gonna happen on my watch.
Yeah.
you know, and they're going, yeah,
Yeah.
well, why not? The Chinese attitude is,
Yeah.
why can't we have a win-win? I mean,
Yeah.
we haven't really had a war with anybody for a really long time, like maybe except for a little fracas with the Vietnamese
Vietnamese. Yeah.
couple of millennia. Okay, so let's get along. Why can't we just get along? Well, again, the Mickey Mat is a real power here. If the U.S. Navy says, "Oh my God, China wants to be the supreme power. We can't let it do that. So we have to double the size of our Navy." And then, Biden's attitude, I hate to reduce it to this, but some of your older listeners will remember cowboy films, right?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe some of you younger. So this fellow comes into town and he says, I don't think this town is big enough for both of us, right?
Hmm.
Well, that's what Biden is saying here to the Chinese. Hey, the Pacific Ocean? I don't think it's big enough for both of us. And so we have U.S. naval ships hugging the Chinese coast. We have bombers that are capable of carrying nuclear weapons going very close to China. One of them was kind of buzzed by a Chinese fighter bomber. The information was it came within 10 feet. I can hardly believe 10 feet, but when they complained to the Chinese says, well, what are you going to do about it? You're in our area here.
Yeah.
And the Chinese, I think, atypically are willing to accept an incident there, which should show that, this is like our Caribbean. Okay. You're welcome to sail in there, but you're not welcome to have very strong naval forces, air forces, and worst of all, threaten to arm Taiwan to the teeth so we'll never be reunited. I agree with you. I don't think Xi Jinping has any idea of conquering Taiwan
No,
militarily.
no.
Okay. Why would he? It's inevitable. It's going to happen. And indeed, the US agreed that Taiwan was an integral part of
Of
China.
China.
Most Americans don't know that. Okay. That was in 71. Okay. So that's still our policy. So what are we doing? Well, the Mickey Mouse is making lots of money. Uh, um, Equipping and arming
Yeah.
Taiwan, and the Chinese unnecessarily or understandably uh, upset about that. So this has come. The Chinese used to have an expression when they were not so, not so erudite. They used to say, "This will come to a no good end." Okay.
Mm.
Well, let's hope that enough reasonable voices in the United States outside the administration would have to be right now
Yeah.
say, look, do you really want to get involved in a war with China? Because you have a war in Europe now, in Ukraine. Do you really want to do a two-front war? And I agree with you. I think the Russians would not stand by idly, as the diplomatic expression goes. No, with the Iranians. No, with the North Koreans. Now, I'm going to divulge a little non-secret to you,
Yeah.
David.
Yeah.
We have extremely accurate technical evidence that the Russians have given one of their very late model intercontinental ballistic missiles to North Korea.
Korea. I confirm this one, Ray. I confirm it because I checked on it. You're right.
ICBMs. Now,
You are right.
Ted Postal, who knows more about this than anyone, he's a professor emeritus physics from MIT,
Mm.
worked for the head of the naval operations in the Pentagon for many years. He says, "Look, here's the technical evidence, and it's exactly the Topol missile." Okay, now that surprised the hell out of me. I am always willing to be surprised, but this happens so rarely. That this kind of surprise. Why would the Russians? I mean, this is not my idea of Putin. The North Koreans, you want to give a missile like this to a country that you don't control? Well, I think maybe if this is all pans out, and it seems to be conclusive evidence,
Yeah.
and Jacob Sullivan was asked about this at a press conference about 2 months ago. What about this missile? And he said, "Oh, we're working on that." So it's not that they don't know about it; they just don't want it to get around. Why? Because if true, it shows that the Russians are so upset and so willing to play fast and loose, not only in Ukraine but now with
Yeah.
this relatively unpredictable behavior type in North Korea, that they will face the US with this additional threat. And they are together in a way that they haven't been for decades, the Russians and the North Koreans. And I've checked with my Chinese experts. They say the Chinese must have winked at this, must have acquiesced in it. The Russians and North Koreans are not going to do something like that without the Chinese buy-in. So there again, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran is a separate issue, but they are also becoming, in effect, a de facto ally of these other three.
Very, very interesting. And thank you for answering this question because I can see the trends of what's taking place right now. For example, with the upcoming opening of NATO's office in Tokyo. Why would NATO go all the way to Japan for? I'm looking also at the US building a naval hub in India. Well, I'm looking at Australia. I'm looking at New Zealand. I'm looking at the Quad. All this to me gives a hint as one who thinks I tend to think down the road the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I'm glad you answered that question, Ray. So let's talk about our last topic here in this conversation. I mean, we can talk forever here. So, and I am sure you guys don't worry. I'm going to have Ray back here on the channel on both. So don't you worry. When he has time, he'll be back here with us. So, Ray, I want to get your feedback, or your input, rather, not a feedback, but rather your insights as one who spent a lot of time regarding the Soviet Union back then and so forth. Regarding the Ukraine conflict, I got a word that the CIA director is going to be heading out to Ukraine. The Secretary of Defense was in Ukraine about a week and a half ago. Are all this a sign to bid farewell to the president comedian Zelensky because Ukraine is a failed state? Or how do you interpret that?
Well, David, if you believe Joe Biden, the president of the United States, Russia has already lost, right?
Oh,
Now, I like to refer to that faux pas that Annalena, what's her name?
Burbank of Germany.
Yeah,
I
the foreign minister of
remember. I
Germany.
remember
You
that,
remember she-
right?
It's not so. It's 360 degrees different.
I remember. It was crazy
Pliable.
to hear that from an official like that at that capacity.
And she got an A in geometry. Anyhow, David, it's 180 degrees away from what Biden said 2 months ago. Okay. So here's Austin. What did he say 3 months ago before Congress? We've given Ukraine 90% of what they need to prevail. We're very hopeful that this counteroffensive is going to work for them, okay? And we're just going to stick with Ukraine for as long as it takes, okay? Well, now, so that was Austin 3-4 months ago. Now it's a different story. Now he knows that it's 180 degrees, not 360 degrees. He's in Kiev last week, and he says, sorry, guys, but we did give you 90% of what you, I mean, we gave Zelensky, the head of your armed forces, 100% of, I mean, 80, he listed it, and we gave all this, and you still lost. I know we encouraged you. I know you were reluctant. I know, well, anyhow, you lost, right? So what are you going to do now? Congress not going to give us any more money. We don't have any 155 millimeter shells for your tanks or your artillery. I mean, we had some, we were going to earmark them for you, but on Congress said, no, give them to Israel instead. So we don't even have those. So, you know, you better learn to fish and cut bait. You got to learn when to hold them and when to fold them, as we used to say. Yeah. And it's folding time now, because you can do what you want. You can pretend, as Zelensky still is, that you're in this fight to the end. Well, the end is next month, guys. You realize that? And we're not going to come in and backfill you. Those Russians can go all the way to the Dnieper River, as you know, but they're going to do attrition for a while. So it's going to be when you decide you've been attrited enough and you stop recruiting 17-year-olds and people almost as old as McGovern here and women into your armed forces. You got to face reality. Now, Zelensky is less delusional than Zelensky, right? So what's going to happen? Well, it seems to me that Zelensky has feathered his bed. He's got a villa in Tuscany, I'm told, maybe a couple others. You know, it's time for him to do what the head of Afghanistan did a couple of years ago: load up that plane with as much cash as you can and get the hell out of Dodge, right? Yeah. That, I think, is inevitable. The sooner the better in terms of what happens to the Ukrainians that are still trying to man those defenses. You know, what's really interesting here is that the Ukrainians could have had a deal. I'm wrong. The Ukrainians did have a deal at the end of March 2002.
Yes. We prevented the Ray from moving forward.
We prevented the Minsk Accords from moving forward. And not only that, but Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, bragged about it. December 2022. Yeah, the Minsk thing. Well, that was just a little stratagem to give the Ukrainians time to build up their
Mm.
armed forces. Look at them now. 6, 7 years ago, they went, "Well, look at them." And then Francois Hollande, the
Yeah.
other guarantor of this thing, said, "Oh yeah, well, Angela is right. It was just a matter of giving Ukraine time to arm up with NATO standards." So the worst thing, though, we know now that Gerhard Schröder from Germany
Germany.
was also asked to play this middleman role. A fellow named Bennett, who had been Israeli prime minister, also attests to the fact that the deal was reached. What happened? The Russians invaded on the 24th of February
February.
2022. Immediately said, "Look, let's talk about this. Did they invade with enough forces to take over Ukraine? No. 90,000 is barely enough to move toward Kiev to frighten them. Did they frighten them? They frightened the hell out of them." Zelensky says, "Let's talk." They got together in Minsk in Belarus at first.
Hmm.
And well, the talks led to Istanbul, Turkey. And by the 29th and the 30th of March, a deal had been initialed. Ukraine would not join NATO. Ukraine would be neutral. That was the base. There were lots of codicils where you
Yeah.
could deploy forces. The whole thing was reached. Now, why do I rehearse all this? Because just this week, 2 days ago, the head Ukrainian negotiator,
Mm.
who's part of Zelensky's party, who's part of a big wielded part in the Ukrainian parliament, he says, "Well, that's right. That's what we had. We had this deal, and I was the negotiator. I, my initials are on that thing, and we probably should have taken it." Well, yeah, we
Yeah.
could have saved 500,000 young Ukrainian men from death and destruction and the whole business. The only people profiteering from this are the Mickey Mat, the people who make and sell the arms and
Mm.
will be in business now for quite some time, and including the agro business. I mean, the Black Earth there in Ukraine. I've been there. I've done that. I've dug a trowel in that Black Earth. You won't believe how fertile that is. Okay, and
Yeah.
the agro business, Monsanto and the others are in there big time. So it's really, the whole thing just smells to high heaven, and uh, and what I want to make is the point that this need not have happened, and who's responsible for this? The Blinkens and the Bidens and the Sullivans that they still think that we can work our will on all this stuff, and the Russians can take a beating from us, sanctions and so forth. Nothing could be farther from the truth,
That's true.
and the sooner they realize that, the better for everyone concerned.
They are amateurs, Ray. That's what I call them. So I have nothing against them, but I call a spade a spade. If you are not qualified for the position, because they lacking the depth in understanding how geopolitics is, how international relations are. I mean, you go back into the 70s, you've been around long enough to know, Ray, that we asked the question, had we sat down with the Soviets back then and the Chinese together, we will have a different outcome in the global affairs today. But we choose not to, because we wanted to always create that enemy, whether real or perceived, to justify whatever policy. So now we're living with the consequences of it. And
Mhm.
having a president pushing us towards some over the cliff here, that kind of makes you wonder. As a citizen, I ain't gonna stay quiet. You're gonna speak the truth, for that matter. I want to ask one final question before I let you go,
Sure.
Ray. And by the way, stay with me at the end after I say bye to our viewers and so forth. Will it be fair to say now, because I look at it this from using the history of World War II, moving forward, how Europe used to be, because to me now Europe is more divided than ever, more weaker than ever. And will it be fair to say now that the Berlin Wall that was in Germany now has moved into Eastern Europe? Will I be fair in this assessment, looking at it that way? How the Russians are thinking now?
Well, they've actually referred to situations just like that
Hmm.
As you know, after promising Gorbachev we wouldn't move NATO 1 inch to the east,
Yeah.
it doubled in size. It doubled in size in the next few years, with all those countries now well more than 1 inch to the east of the East German border. So the new Iron Curtain is the one that goes on the other side. Well, it divides the Baltics now
No.
from
Okay.
Russia, and it goes right down Poland and the rest of it. So, but that's not going to last very long, because
Mm.
you have the Slovakia, you have Hungary, you have voices in other parts of the former Eastern Europe
Yeah.
saying this doesn't make any sense. We thought the U.S. was had our good primarily in mind. We thought we needed to be defended against the Russians, and we really don't, because we see this. We see what happened in Ukraine. One last thing that never is brought to mind here, David, is
Yeah.
this factoid. Okay, we ran out of the basic ammunition shells, 155 millimeter shells that I trained with at Fort Benning 5 decades ago. Okay, 155, 105 millimeter howitzers and so forth. All right. So
Yeah.
now, um, if Russia was a threat to Europe, one would think that one would have produced 155 millimeter
Yeah.
shells for the howitzers. And so one can reason that, nobody really took Russia seriously as a threat once the Soviet Union imploded, once Gorbachev and once Putin reached out and said, look, let us join NATO. So why build 155 millimeter when you can spend all that money on these high tech things like aircraft, like the
Hmm.
F-35 that costs $500 million. Let's
Very
do
well.
that instead. So as a result of that, the inevitable conclusion is the Russians had no idea of attacking Western Europe. They had no idea of attacking Ukraine until they were forced to it. And I can prove that they had no other choice. What was going on there against Russian speaking people in the Donbass, what the
Yes.
Nazis were doing in Kiev, the rest of it, uh, Putin went in with limited aims, and that's provable by the amount of forces that he put into it. And then his immediate, they reached an agreement, for God's sake, at the end of March, April 2002. So can we reach agreement now? Well, of
Yeah.
course we have to reach an agreement now. We have to get rid of this shibboleth, this this picture of the Russian ogre trying to pounce on Western Europe, where nothing is further from the truth. This was a defensive action, and it's easily proven to have been a defensive action. And I've been with this problem for more decades than I'm
Yeah.
care to admit.
Interesting. I know I did say the last word, but I have one more, Ray. I can't let you go without this, because to me, it's about time that this question has to sort of everybody has to talk about this one. And this question is this: is it over for NATO? Is NATO irrelevant? Given what just took place now,
Yeah.
what the Russians showed, the strength vis-a-vis what's taking place in Ukraine, is NATO is irrelevant?
David, that's a good question. The reality is that NATO is the United States.
True.
It used to be more than the United States, but the United States is what's becoming irrelevant.
Mm.
Bear in mind, there are all kinds of people objected to creating NATO way back in the late 1940s. 49, I think, was created. And they said, if you create NATO, that will be a military alliance, and the Russians are they're gonna react really badly. Now, most people don't really know that NATO came first. Only 6 years later, did the Russians get so scared that they say, my God, we better create the Warsaw Pact. Okay.
Right.
So which came first? NATO. What was
Yeah.
the idea? To keep the Russians out of Europe, to keep the US in Europe, and keep the Germans
Down.
down, keep them
Right.
divided. So, little footnote here. When I heard that Gorbachev and other people were entertaining the idea of a reunited Germany. I mean, my reaction was, you know, maybe I saw too many war movies when I was a kid, but that NATO was not was not to let a reunited. So now the U.S. and people know this suffered maybe 440,000 people dead in World War II. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a lot. That's really sorrowful. Okay, the Russians the Russians suffered 26 million with an M people dead
Yeah.
in World War II. Now, we have this great ocean between Europe and us, so we would save the destruction as well as the people lost. The Russians, not so much. So here's the US going to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, his foreign secretary, foreign minister, and saying, look, here's the deal. We want a reunited Germany. Now, they probably went the same way. And so, okay, that's a big quid. That's a tough pill. What are you going to give us? Where's the quo for this quid? And that's where Baker, this smart lawyer from Texas, James
Yeah.
Baker,
James.
Secretary of State for Bush, he said, well, how would it be? Yeah, how's this for an idea? We will promise, cross your heart, hope to die, not to move NATO 1 inch to the east. How would that be? Well, at that point, the Russians were so much in need of the kind of economic help that we had already given the Poles, okay? And that they just needed us, and they trusted us. And last thing I'll say is when I talked to Kuvaldin, what's his name? Victor? No, I forget his name and patronym. His name was Kuvaldin. He was he's in all the photos there of
Yeah.
the talks, okay? The talks when James Baker came. So I asked Mr. Kuvaldin, I was in Moscow about 10 years ago, and I said, why was that promise not written down? And he looked at me and he said, Mr. McGovern, hey, I'll give you the two valid but not satisfactory answers. One is the Warsaw Pact still existed, so we had it. And the second one is we need to get explicit German buy-in, and that hadn't been happened yet. But the real reason, Mr. Governor, you want to know what the real reason was? I said, yeah. He said, we trusted you.
Wow.
Now there's no trust left. There's no communication left. So we have to make sure that our leaders, to the extent we can, proceed more sensibly than they've done in the past. And when they lose in Ukraine, take it on the chin, dress it up as much as you can, put as much lipstick on that pig as you can, but don't start thinking about mini nukes or other ways to show how strong you are and how this continent is not big enough for both of us.
Very, very, very interesting. Wow, wow. Well, guys, I hope you find the insights from Mr. McGovern very insightful. I'm sure you will not take my word for it, as one been around enough to know how the media can manipulate the language and so forth. You won't hear this anywhere else, and we are very grateful to Ray for really carving out time for us because I'm sure, yes, he's retired and so forth, but beside the point, he had to enjoy his life and so forth. But for him to give us this time to sit here and share this knowledge that you will not get anywhere else, we are very, very grateful. Thank you so much, Ray. We truly appreciate it. Appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you again. For you guys, please
Most
make
welcome.
sure to hit the like button and look forward to seeing you next time. As always, prepare yourself for a changing world order. Till next time. Bye-bye.